Welcome to Book Nibbles. Big ideas, small bites. The story of killing Jesus begins long before the man himself walks the earth, for Bill O'Reilly and Martin Dugard deliberately situate the reader in the swirl of history, politics, and ambition that shaped the ancient world into which Jesus was born. The Roman Empire had extended its reach deep into the eastern Mediterranean, subjugating territories through a blend of military might and political manipulation. The Jews of Judea found themselves under foreign domination, their religious devotion clashing with Rome's practical, often brutal exercise of control. Herod the Great, the local ruler set in place by the Romans, was himself a master of cruelty and calculation, a man whose paranoia led him to murder even his own family members to protect his throne. O'Reilly paints Herod as both brilliant and monstrous, a man who could expand the Second Temple to unprecedented glory, while at the same time ordering the massacre of innocents if he thought his rule was under threat. It is in this atmosphere of treachery, religious expectation, and oppression that the story of Jesus begins. The book takes the reader to Bethlehem, where Mary and Joseph struggle with the indignity of Roman decrees that uproot entire families for the purpose of taxation and census-taking. The arrival of Jesus into the world is not bathed in divine fireworks in O'Reilly's telling, but rather grounded in historical grit, in the pain and vulnerability of childbirth under harsh conditions. This approach makes the story less a theological retelling and more a historical immersion, where miracles are noted, but the emphasis lies on what could reasonably be reconstructed from the political and cultural climate of the time. The gospel stories of angels, shepherds, and magi are acknowledged, but O'Reilly aims to show the wider stage, what it meant to be born Jewish under Roman domination, where the hope for a Messiah was not abstract but woven into daily prayers for liberation. Herod's paranoia soon spills over into what has come down as the slaughter of the innocents, when, upon hearing that a potential rival king has been born, he orders the killing of male infants. Whether every detail is historically verifiable or not, O'Reilly shows how Herod's character makes such cruelty believable. At the same time, this episode underscores how fragile and threatened Jesus' life was from the very start. The Holy Family's flight into Egypt is described less as a myth and more as a desperate move for survival, as many Jewish families had fled to Egypt in times of crisis. This also sets the stage for the motif of exile and return that would follow Jesus throughout his ministry. As the narrative moves forward, the reader is given a vivid picture of what life was like in Nazareth and Galilee. O'Reilly and Dugard make clear that Nazareth was not some grand city but a tiny village, obscure and looked down upon by many in Judea. Jesus grows up in this modest environment, learning the trade of carpentry from Joseph, absorbing the rhythms of Jewish prayer, festival, and scripture. Here the book excels in painting the ordinariness of Jesus' youth, grounding him firmly in the everyday toil of peasants under Rome's yoke. The heavy taxes imposed by both Rome and the local Herodian rulers meant that peasants lived precariously close to ruin. Into this economic reality Jesus matured, experiencing firsthand the injustices and the yearnings of ordinary people. Parallel to this, O'Reilly does not let the reader forget the immense machinery of Rome that grinds along in the background. The emperors, Augustus, then Tiberius, are described with detail that highlights their ruthless power, their ability to command armies, and their obsession with securing their legacies. Augustus is depicted as shrewd and capable, establishing the Pax Romana, the so-called Roman peace that was maintained through violence and the suppression of dissent. Tiberius, who succeeds him, is painted as brooding, paranoid, and increasingly cruel. These emperors set the tone for the governors and procurators who would administer Judea, figures like Pontius Pilate, who would ultimately play a central role in the trial and execution of Jesus. By fleshing out the Roman context, the book drives home the point that Jesus' death was not a small-town event, but one entangled in the global power struggles of the ancient world. The emergence of John the Baptist provides the bridge from Jesus' obscurity into his public mission. John's fiery preaching along the Jordan River, his calls for repentance, and his willingness to confront Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great, make him both a religious phenomenon and a political threat. O'Reilly highlights how dangerous such preaching was in a land where any hint of rebellion could be seen as sedition. Jesus' decision to be baptized by John signals both humility and boldness, for by aligning himself with John, he was stepping into a stream of prophetic tradition that challenged both religious complacency and political oppression. O'Reilly portrays the baptism as a pivotal moment, one that inaugurates Jesus' mission and sets him on a collision course with the authorities. From here, the narrative unfolds through the familiar but freshly contextualized episodes of Jesus' ministry: the calling of disciples, the Sermon on the Mount, the parables that cut to the heart of human hypocrisy, and the miracles that attracted both devotion and suspicion. O'Reilly underscores the radical nature of Jesus' teaching, not merely in spiritual terms but in its social and political implications. For instance, when Jesus teaches that the meek shall inherit the earth, or that one should love one's enemies, these are not abstract aphorisms but revolutionary statements in a land yearning for violent overthrow of Rome. His healings, too, are shown not only as acts of compassion but as challenges to religious authorities who saw themselves as the gatekeepers of purity. By healing the sick, touching lepers, and forgiving sins, Jesus undermined the authority of the temple establishment. The disciples are portrayed as a ragtag group of ordinary men, fishermen, a tax collector, zealots, hardly the type of individuals one would expect to lead a world-changing movement. O'Reilly highlights their misunderstandings, their doubts, their infighting, making them relatable and human. This also emphasizes how extraordinary it was that Jesus' message took root and spread despite their shortcomings. The tension between Jesus and the religious elite, especially the Pharisees and Sadducees, is given historical grounding. These groups, though different in theology, both had a vested interest in maintaining order under Rome's oversight. Jesus' growing popularity and his attacks on hypocrisy threatened that delicate balance, making him a dangerous figure in their eyes. As the narrative moves toward Jerusalem, the stakes rise. O'Reilly captures the significance of Jesus' entry into the city during Passover, a festival already charged with nationalistic fervor and hope for liberation. Riding on a donkey, welcomed by crowds crying, "Hosanna," Jesus is not only fulfilling messianic prophecy but making a provocative political statement, one that the Roman authorities could not ignore. The cleansing of the temple, where he overturns the money changers' tables, is described as a direct assault on the economic and religious establishment, sealing his fate in the eyes of both the temple leaders and the Roman overseers. The plotting of the chief priests and the betrayal by Judas Iscariot are described in stark, almost cinematic detail. O'Reilly resists overly theological explanations, focusing instead on the practical motivations: fear of Rome, desire to maintain control, disillusionment on Judas' part. The Last Supper is presented not merely as a sacred ritual, but as a poignant farewell, where Jesus, aware of what is coming, tries to prepare his disciples for the ordeal ahead. The human drama is underscored: the confusion of the disciples, the sorrow of impending loss, and the heavy burden Jesus carries knowing he is walking into death. The arrest in Gethsemane, the trials before the Sanhedrin and Pilate, and the brutal scourging are described with a historian's eye for detail. O'Reilly explains the Roman practice of crucifixion, its purpose as a tool of terror, designed to deter rebellion by making an example of the condemned. The description of the scourging, lashes embedded with bone and metal-tearing flesh, is graphic, meant to help readers understand the physical torment Jesus endured. Pilate is portrayed not as a purely evil figure, but as a calculating politician, reluctant to crucify Jesus, but ultimately bending to the pressure of the mob and his own fear of Rome's judgment. This complexity underscores the tragic inevitability of the outcome. The march to Golgotha, the nailing to the cross, and the agonizing hours of crucifixion are recounted with both pathos and historical clarity. O'Reilly stresses that crucifixion was not only excruciating but humiliating, stripping the condemned of dignity. The detail of Jesus forgiving those who crucify him, offering words of comfort to the thief beside him, and crying out in anguish, brings out the duality of suffering and grace. In O'Reilly's account, The crucifixion is not romanticized but laid bare as a brutal execution, the kind of death reserved for the lowest of criminals, and yet in this humiliation, Jesus' message of love and forgiveness shines most clearly. The aftermath, the burial in a borrowed tomb, the fear of the disciples, the uncertainty of what would follow, is presented with restraint, acknowledging the accounts of resurrection without delving into theological debates. Instead, O'Reilly emphasizes the historical reality that something extraordinary must have occurred to transform a terrified group of disciples into bold proclaimers of a message that would eventually upend the Roman world. The spread of Christianity, he suggests, is itself testimony to the profound impact of Jesus' life and death. Throughout the book, O'Reilly and Dugard employ a narrative style that makes history accessible, blending storytelling with research. They avoid heavy theological exposition, aiming instead for a fast-paced, almost cinematic retelling that brings ancient figures to life. The use of vivid detail, whether in describing Herod's cruelty, the dusty roads of Galilee, or the mechanics of crucifixion, serves to ground the story in reality, reminding readers that these events unfolded in real time, with real consequences to real people. One of the key takeaways is how fragile yet powerful Jesus' mission was. Fragile, because it depended on a small group of ordinary followers and unfolded under the shadow of one of history's greatest empires. Powerful, because despite that fragility, the message endured, resonating across centuries. O'Reilly highlights the paradox that the empire which sought to crush him ultimately provided the very roads and communication networks that allowed his message to spread. In this way, history itself became an instrument of the divine, even as political forces conspired against him. The book leaves the reader with both admiration and reflection. Admiration for the historical sweep, the way it connects the dots between Rome, Judea, and the man from Nazareth. Reflection, because in stripping the story down to its historical core, it invites readers to consider what made Jesus' life and death so compelling that billions still follow him today. It is not merely the miracles or the prophecies, but the radical call to love, to forgive, and to live differently in a world dominated by power and fear. By the time the final page is turned, Killing Jesus has woven together politics, religion, and human drama into a cohesive narrative that feels both ancient and relevant. It shows Jesus not as an untouchable figure floating above history, but as a man enmeshed in it, whose choices and teachings challenged the mightiest empire on earth. The book does not claim to provide all answers, nor does it delve deeply into theology, but it succeeds in making the story come alive for readers who may know the outlines but not the texture of the times. Ultimately, the power of the book lies in its accessibility. O'Reilly and Dugard invite the reader to walk the dusty roads, to feel the tension of Roman occupation, to sit among the disciples at the Last Supper, and to stand in the crowd at Golgotha. In doing so, they bridge the gap between ancient history and modern readers, making the story of Jesus' life and death not only a matter of faith but of historical imagination. The brutal truth of crucifixion, the corruption of power, the fragility of hope, and the endurance of love are themes that echo across the centuries, and Killing Jesus captures them in a way that is both grounded and compelling. And that's it. Killing Jesus by Bill O'Reilly and Martin Dugard. Thanks for listening to Book Nibbles. If you enjoyed this bite-sized book, don't forget to subscribe for more quick, insightful summaries. See you in the next nibble.